Not every losing season is the same. And some teams, when they finish 5-11, it represents one thing, or 7-9, it represents one thing. And other times, it represents something else different. And I look at the Philadelphia Eagles, and I say, under a first-year head coach, Doug Peterson, with a new coaching staff, you had a defense that switched to a 4-3 scheme that I thought acquitted itself very nicely to the new coaching staff, to the new scheme that they were put in. You had a rookie quarterback in Carson Wentz coming from North Dakota State that had all this buzz about him that you gave up a lot to go get him, and he didn't come out and crap the bed. In fact, he started off the season very strongly, starting off 3-0, and Carson Wentz looked like, man, this dude's legit real time, and I still think he is. But the reality of the league started catching up with him a little bit. His mechanics, I thought, broke down a little bit as the season went along, and he didn't look quite as good, but he didn't totally bomb. And you look at that and you say, combining that with the frankly limited help that Wentz had on the offensive side of the ball, you feel like it was a successful season for the Eagles. Like there's a reason for some buzz and for some excitement. There's a reason for some hope for the future. And that's a good place to be after the end of the disaster that was the Chip Kelly era. But it's not surprising to see that this team was pretty aggressive in the offseason in free agency, realizing that, hey, we've got some work to do. We need to help out a young quarterback. We could also fortify some areas of our defense, and that's what they set out to do. I do want to point out that, I'm usually not a big fan of spending a ton of money in free agency because that tends to not work. But I don't think that anything that the Eagles did in the offseason via free agencies, via trades, was anything out of the realm of acceptable. Like, you brought in Alshon Jeffrey, but it's on a one-year deal. And that's exactly the type of deal the Philadelphia Eagles should have been giving Alshon Jeffrey. And for you Eagles fans that want some insight from me, being a Bears fan, seeing Alshon the past 5 years, what are you going to get from Alshon? I'll tell you exactly what you're going to get. You'll be lucky to get 16 games out of him. He'll probably spend several games injured or hurt, where he has limited effectiveness on the field, or he's not on the field at all. You will have a couple of games where he plays like a monster. You'll be able to hit some big plays down the field. He'll win some jump balls. He'll be a decent red zone target. And then you'll have other games where you're like paging Alshon Jeffrey, where the fuck is this dude? And he frustrates the hell out of you. He can put up some nice numbers as the season plays out over its entirety, but that is more so due to he'll have a couple of big games and then several games where you hear nothing from him. But again, you got him on a one-year prove-it deal type of situation, so he will definitely be motivated to try and play better, play the best he ever has, you would hope, you would think. But the Bears organization probably thought that heading into 2016 with him under the franchise taking out of that workout. Just saying. But they brought in Torrey Smith, a guy that left Baltimore, went to San Francisco, took the money, and it didn't work out for a variety of reasons. But you bring him back here, you've got a much more capable quarterback, a much more capable offensive system. You would hope that you'd be able to get something back out of him. LeGarrette Blount was brought in free agency. We'll see how committed the team is to him being the featured running back. But the hope is that he could provide some stability out of the backfield. Then defensively, you bring in Timmy Jernigan. You trade away Jordan Matthews because you felt like you kind of had a surplus at wide receiver with Jeffrey Smith and Nelson Aguilar. You bring in a Ronald Darby to address a gaping void in your secondary. I thought the Eagles made some solid, respectable, understandable moves in the offseason. And then with the work in the draft, we got to point out that they were able to turn Sam Bradford into a first-round pick. So the whole thing of dealing up for Carson Wentz like they did, all it really effectively ultimately did for them in the 2017 draft in round one was because of the Sam Bradford deal on the back end, they moved down 2 spots from 12 to 14, which allowed them to get Derek Barnett. I did think it was interesting with this draft class, though, is how heavily they invested on the defensive side of the ball after doing what they did to trade up and get a Carson Wentz. Usually I am a fan of when you draft a young franchise quarterback, at least that draft and the following draft should primarily be dedicated to building up the offensive side of the football around that kid. Because ultimately, you will win as an organization, succeed or fail as an organization based off of what that young quarterback does or doesn't, how his development goes or doesn't go. So I'm usually not a fan of teams drafting so heavily on the defensive side of the ball the year after drafting a young quarterback. With that said, I don't really have any quibbles about what the Eagles did. While I wasn't as high on Derek Barnett as others, and I could very well be wrong about him, I didn't say he couldn't play, didn't think he wasn't a starter. I just didn't see a top 15 talent. I will say, coming into a system where he gets to play around guys like Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham and a Timmy Jernigan and others, Derek Barnett could have a chance to come in and be able to contribute very nicely as a rookie and probably have more sacks than Myles Garrett. And that was even saying if Myles Garrett actually played all 16 games, but of course, because Cleveland took him, those poor people, he ultimately won't. But Barnett was a solid first-round selection for them. Then in round 2, Sidney Jones falls into your lap. I know he had the Achilles injury, and you don't know if he's going to play in 2017 or not, but you're in a place where this kid's a first-round pick if he's healthy. He's there for you in the middle of round 2. You must take him. You must risk the redshirt year because the talent and upside is too great. Especially when you're talking about one of the biggest weaknesses on your team, offensive or defense, was your secondary last year. To get a first-round talent like that in the middle of round 2, you kind of have to do it. But then you kind of double up with Rasul Douglas to try and hedge your bet because if Sidney Jones doesn't work out, then you've wasted a second-round pick. Maybe Rasul Douglas does work out, and you've saved one of the third-round picks. And then even getting a guy like Matt Collins from North Carolina, you've got somebody on the offensive side of the ball in round 4. I think there's a chance he might contribute a little bit as a role player on the offense in 2017. So I did kind of like what the Eagles did, even though, again, like I said, from a philosophical standpoint, I typically will kind of knock teams for doing this. I understood, based off of the situation, how things played out. When you look at this team heading into the season, what's going to be their keys to success? The defensive front. That front 4 is really, really good. They should be able to play the run well and be able to generate some pass rush. And if Derek Barnett comes in and contributes right away, that defensive front could be really, really damn good. I think their offensive line, if you've got Jason Peters healthy and Lane Johnson there and not getting suspended, can be good, especially with those 2 bookend tackles protecting your young quarterback. That's a good place to be. I think their wide receiving crew is improved. I don't know if it's really a strength of the team, but I think it's improved. And then you throw a Zach Ertz into the mix. Special teams. We don't talk enough about special teams. And the Philadelphia Eagles, with guys like Darren Sproles and just their units in general, they acquit themselves very well. And their special teams can be a contributing factor several times a year to them winning games. And we've seen this play out throughout the Chip Kelly era, and we saw it last year as well. And I expect that to be the case here again in 2017. What are the questions for this team, though? I'm concerned about the running game. Is LeGarrette Blount at a point where he's still got something left in the tank? Is he going to be a fit for their offense? Is he going to do well? If not, is somebody else going to be able to step into the fold and make a bit of a difference? They need a more consistent, solid, established running game than what they had in 2016. Then I look at the back end of that defense. Yes, you brought in Ronald Darby. You've invested some money in draft picks there. But it's still a concern because it was still a weakness for the team. I expect the unit to be improved. But how much remains to be seen. But ultimately, the question's still going to be about Carson Wentz. You saw some flashes of greatness from him early in 2016, and then you saw some flashes of, oh boy, he's got a long ways to go the rest of 2016. Now that you've improved some of the help around him on the offensive side of the ball, assuming those guys don't flake out or they don't get hurt, it's going to be incumbent upon Carson Wentz to get better in year number 2. He's got to show more. Ultimately, his team invested a lot in him in terms of draft pick currency and investing a number 2 overall pick in him. He needs to step up and he needs to play better. And I expect him to this year, and it's not just because I'm a Carson Wentz nut hugger. It's probably some because of that, but not totally because of that. When I look at this team's schedule, I think early on in the season, they got 3 of their first 4 on the road, which is always a tough ask. Got to go to Washington, then to Kansas City, host the Giants in week 3. So that's your one home game is against a solid Giants team. And then you got to go to the Chargers in week 4. So the Eagles will have a tough early stretch here. Might soften up a little bit week 7 through 9 because I believe it's 3 straight home games. If one of these games is in London, I apologize. I just didn't fucking look it up. But Washington, San Francisco, Denver, maybe there's a chance for them to make a little hay. But then again, week 12 through 14, you've got 3 straight road games, which doesn't do them a lot of favors. They got to go to Seattle, to the Rams, and to the Giants. So when I look at this schedule, already factoring in that, I look at the NFC East and can envision this year it's even tougher, and these teams are going to really beat up on each other. and I see where this team's got to go to Seattle and they got to go to Kansas City. It's going to be really tough for the Eagles to have a winning record, in my opinion. I think they will only be improved. I think they'll be better. I think they'll be close. I wouldn't be surprised if they could potentially sneak up on people and win 9 or 10 games. But I think for me right now, 8-8, even though it's not the playoffs, even though it's not in theory in terms of a record, a lot of improvement. If you can go at 8-8, but you got more out of Carson Wentz, that should make you feel better if you're an Eagles fan for 2018 and beyond.